Have you ever felt like love was something you had to earn? Like no matter what you did, when it was never quite enough? That's not love. That's control dressed as care. And if you grew up with narcissistic parents, you already know this truth in your bones. Because in their world, love isn't given, it's traded. Love in a healthy family is supposed to be unconditional, a steady force that tells a child, you belong here exactly as you are. But in a narcissistic household, love becomes a transaction. It's not given freely, it's earned. Every moment of warmth is conditional, tied to how well you meet their expectations, how obedient you are, or how much you reflect their ideal image. This is what I call love as a transaction. And it's one of the most damaging legacies narcissistic parents leave behind. When you grow up in that kind of environment, love feels like a prize you have to work for. You start believing that approval equals worth. You learn to perform, to please, to adapt, all to keep the peace and avoid rejection. A smile from them feels like oxygen. A sigh of disappointment feels like punishment. They don't have to say the words out loud. You can feel their disapproval like a shadow following you everywhere. And so, even as a child, you begin to shape yourself into what they want. The perfect student, the helpful child, the quiet one, the achiever, the rescuer. But here's the truth no one tells you. That kind of love isn't real love. It's control disguised as affection. It's not about who you are, but what you can do to serve their emotional needs. A narcissistic parent often sees their child as an extension of themselves, a mirror that must reflect back perfection, success, or admiration. When you do well, they take credit. When you falter, they see it as a personal failure. You stop being a child in their eyes and become a tool, something that validates their worth. Over time, this conditional love rewires your entire emotional system. You start to measure relationships through the same lens. What do I need to do to be loved? You might overgive, over-explain, or overwork just to earn someone's attention. You might even find comfort in partners or friends who make you prove your value because it feels familiar. The pattern of transactional love follows you, even when you swear you've left it behind. And yet, within that pain lies the doorway to healing. The moment you start to see that their version of love was never about you, you begin to reclaim your truth. Their inability to love unconditionally says nothing about your worth and everything about their wounds. Narcissistic parents operate from emptiness. They can only give what they have, and what they have is conditional. Healing begins when you stop performing for love, when you catch yourself trying to earn approval and instead pause and remind yourself, I am enough even if no one applauds. The shift is subtle but powerful. Love stops being a currency and becomes a presence. You begin to build relationships where love isn't traded, it's shared, freely, equally, without scorekeeping. Because real love isn't a deal. It's not something you chase, beg for, or perform to receive. It's the quiet truth that was always inside you, waiting to be remembered. Control is one of the most deceptive forms of manipulation because it rarely introduces itself as domination. In narcissistic families, it often comes wearing a mask labeled care. It sounds like concern, looks like guidance, and feels like protection. But beneath it lies the desire to possess, to dictate, to mold. Narcissistic parents use control disguised as care to maintain power over their children, convincing them that every choice made for them is for their own good. It's a subtle erosion of autonomy, one small, I know what's best for you, at a time. At first, it can seem loving. A parent who chooses your clothes, your friends, your hobbies, who constantly tells you how the world works and who to trust. But over time, you begin to notice that their care has strings attached. Every suggestion is actually a command. Every boundary you try to assert is treated as rebellion. You're not being guided, you're being managed. And when you resist, they don't argue with facts. They attack with guilt. I only want what's best for you, they say, as if your independence is a form of betrayal. This kind of control teaches you to doubt yourself. You start to believe that your feelings, your instincts, and your decisions are untrustworthy. You learn to defer to their judgment because it's easier than facing their disapproval or rage. Over time, you lose touch with your inner compass, the natural sense of who you are and what you want. They replace it with fear, fear of disappointing them, fear of failing, fear of being alone. And fear, once planted, is the perfect tool for control. The most dangerous part of this dynamic is that it doesn't always look abusive. Outsiders often see a parent who's deeply involved, who seems devoted, but the child feels suffocated. Their privacy is invaded under the excuse of protection. Their emotions are policed under the pretense of love. The parent decides which dreams are acceptable and which are unrealistic. They define success, identity, even morality. And the child learns to live in that small, suffocating box of conditional approval. Eventually, this pattern shapes the child's entire understanding of relationships. As adults, they might seek partners or authority figures who replicate the same dynamic. People who take charge, who decide for them, who wrap control in kindness. Because it feels familiar, it feels safe. That's the cruel paradox. When you grow up equating control with care, freedom feels terrifying. Healing begins when you start to separate care from control. Real care nurtures growth. It allows space for mistakes, questions, and individuality. Real care says, I trust you to become who you are meant to be. Control says, I'll only love you if you become who I need you to be. The difference between the two is the difference between living and merely surviving. When you finally reclaim your right to choose, your feelings, your path, your truth, you begin to understand what love really is. Love doesn't imprison, it doesn't shrink you. Love expands, it gives you wings, not chains. Emotional invalidation is one of the most painful and invisible forms of abuse in a narcissistic family. It's not always loud or violent. Sometimes it's a quiet dismissal, a sigh, a rolled eye, a well-timed silence that tells you your feelings don't matter. Narcissistic parents have little tolerance for emotional reality unless it centers around them. They often see a child's emotions as inconvenient, dramatic, or even disrespectful. When you cry, they accuse you of being too sensitive. When you express anger, you're told you're ungrateful. When you try to explain yourself, they twist your words or mock your tone. Over time, you learn one simple rule: it's safer not to feel at all. Children in narcissistic families quickly realize that emotional honesty comes at a cost. Expressing sadness might lead to ridicule. Showing fear might invite punishment. Even joy can be met with envy or indifference. The message becomes clear: your inner world has no safe witness. So you start to bury your feelings. You smile when you're hurting. You agree when you want to scream. You disconnect from your own emotions to keep the peace. What begins as self-protection slowly turns into emotional numbness. The tragedy of emotional invalidation is that it cuts you off from the very compass that helps you navigate life: your feelings. Emotions are signals. They tell you when something feels right, when something hurts, when something's not okay. But if you've spent years being told your emotions are wrong or exaggerated, you stop trusting yourself. You start to second-guess your every reaction. You ask yourself, am I overreacting? Am I crazy? This self-doubt becomes the narcissistic parent's most powerful legacy, an internalized silencer that keeps you small long after they've left the room. For many adult survivors, this pattern continues in relationships. You attract people who issue the same way your parents did because part of you still believes that's normal. You minimize your pain so others won't walk away. You apologize for having needs. You convince yourself that being easygoing is the same as being loved. But deep inside, there's a quiet ache, the yearning to finally be seen, heard, and validated without judgment. Healing begins the moment you realize your feelings were never the problem. They were the truth trying to survive in an environment that couldn't handle it. When you start giving yourself permission to feel, to cry, to rage, to grieve, you reclaim the parts of you that were exiled for so long. You learn that emotions aren't weakness, they're wisdom. They're the language of your soul, the map back to your authentic self. The work is not easy. At first, feeling again can be terrifying. It may even feel wrong because you were trained to equate stillness with safety. But every time you allow yourself to feel something and stay with it, you break another link in the chain of invalidation. Slowly, you begin to rebuild trust with yourself. You realize that your emotions are not too much, they are just enough. They are the proof that you are human, alive, and free to be exactly who you are. In a narcissistic family, identity becomes distorted because you are not seen as an individual. You are seen as a mirror. Your existence revolves around how well you reflect your parents' idealized image of themselves. When you succeed, they take credit, basking in the glow of your achievements as proof of their greatness. When you struggle, they feel shame and distance themselves from you, as if your flaws are stains on their reputation. In this dynamic, you lose the right to exist as your own person. You become a reflection of what they want to see, not a being with your own thoughts, dreams, or emotions. As a child, you start to notice that their love feels different depending on how well you serve their ego. When you make them look good by achieving, pleasing, or conforming, their attention feels warm, even intoxicating. But when you express independence, challenge their views, or fail to meet their standards, the warmth turns cold. You may be met with silence, criticism, or passive-aggressive withdrawal. This emotional whiplash teaches you to adjust constantly, to be the version of yourself that earns approval. You become an expert in reading their moods, anticipating their needs, and suppressing your own. Over time, this reflection-based love leaves a deep wound. You don't know who you are without them. Your sense of self becomes external, built on reactions, expectations, and performance. You may even begin to fear authenticity because being real has always come with rejection. You internalize the belief that your worth depends on how well you shine in their eyes, and so you live in a quiet state of self-abandonment, always looking outward for validation, always terrified of disappointing the mirror that raised you. As you grow older, this pattern doesn't just disappear. You might find yourself drawn to relationships where you're valued for what you provide, your success, your beauty, your loyalty, rather than who you truly are. You might even repeat the narcissistic pattern yourself, needing others to mirror your worth because you never learned how to hold it from within. That's the generational echo of narcissism, the inability to see yourself clearly without someone else defining the reflection. The path to healing begins when you finally shatter that mirror. It starts with asking, "Who am I when no one is watching?" At first, the answer feels unclear because you've spent so long being who they needed you to be. But little by little, you begin to rediscover your own reflection, one that isn't tied to performance or approval. You learn to like yourself not because of what you achieve, but because of what you feel, what you value, and what you choose. When you stop existing as a reflection, you step into your own light. You realize that your worth was never meant to be borrowed, it was meant to be lived. And in that moment, you break the cycle because you no longer need to be a mirror. You finally become real. Guilt is one of the narcissistic parents' most effective tools of control because it doesn't need shouting or punishment. It only needs suggestion. It whispers, "After all I've done for you," or "You're breaking my heart." These words may sound loving, but they are designed to trap you in emotional debt. Narcissistic parents use guilt to rewrite reality, making you responsible for their happiness, their pain, and even their identity. You become the caretaker of their emotions, constantly adjusting yourself to keep them content. It's a quiet form of manipulation that keeps you obedient without visible chains. In such a family, guilt becomes the currency of love. You are made to feel guilty for wanting independence, for saying no, for expressing frustration, or even for needing boundaries. If you pull away, you're ungrateful. If you assert yourself, you're cruel. The roles are reversed. The parent becomes the victim, and the child becomes the villain. This emotional inversion creates deep confusion. You start to believe that taking care of yourself hurts others and that your worth comes from sacrifice. You begin to associate love with self-denial. Over time, this guilt doesn't just come from your parent. It starts to live inside you. It becomes an internal voice that polices your choices. Even as an adult, you might feel anxious when you put your needs first, or when you make a decision that might disappoint someone. You might over-apologize, over-give, or over-explain because you've been conditioned to feel responsible for everyone's feelings. This is how the narcissistic parent's control survives long after you've left their home, through the guilt they planted in your mind. The most devastating part of this conditioning is that it often hides behind love. They may say, "I just want to help you," or "I sacrificed everything for you," but the underlying message is clear. You owe me. It's not about care, it's about ownership. Every act of kindness becomes a transaction, and every expression of individuality feels like betrayal. You learn to keep your true self small to protect their comfort, but no matter how much you give, it's never enough, because guilt has no finish line. Healing from guilt-based manipulation begins with recognizing what's yours and what isn't. Their pain, their disappointment, their unmet dreams, those were never your burdens to carry. You can feel compassion for them without surrendering your freedom. You can love them and still say no. The key is to understand that guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It's a conditioned response to control. When you begin to release that inherited guilt, something incredible happens. You start to breathe differently. You realize that peace doesn't come from keeping everyone else happy. It comes from being honest with yourself. The moment you stop apologizing for existing, you reclaim your power, because love that demands guilt isn't love, it's bondage. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It allows you to stand tall, whole, and unapologetically free. The most haunting part of growing up with narcissistic parents isn't just the things they said. It's the voice they left behind inside your mind. Long after you've moved away or cut contact, that inner echo remains. It's the voice that whispers, "You're not enough, you're too much," or "You'll never make it without me." This is the silent legacy of narcissistic parenting, the internalized critic that continues their work long after they're gone. It's not just emotional pain, it's psychological programming, built from years of conditioning where love was conditional and worth was always up for debate. As a child, you had no choice but to internalize their version of reality. You depended on them for survival, so when they belittled or dismissed you, you assumed they must be right. You learned that self-doubt was safer than confrontation. You believed that their disapproval meant you were broken. Slowly, their voice became your inner compass, the distorted measure by which you judged your every action, choice, and dream. You began to police yourself, anticipating their criticism even before it came, and over time, you didn't need them to silence you, you did it yourself. This inner voice becomes so woven into your identity that it can feel impossible to separate from who you are. You may achieve incredible things, yet still feel unworthy. You may crave love, but push it away out of fear that you'll disappoint someone. You may appear confident on the outside, yet constantly battle an invisible war within. That's the mark of the narcissistic parent's legacy. They teach you to doubt your worth, and then you carry that doubt as if it's truth. Healing this silent inheritance is not about erasing the voice, but about recognizing it for what it is, a lie that once kept you safe. It's the echo of survival, not the sound of your truth. When you begin to notice that voice, when you pause and ask, whose words are these? You start to take your power back. Every time you challenge it, every time you choose self-compassion over self-criticism, you weaken its grip. Healing isn't a single moment of awakening. It's a gradual unlearning of everything you were taught to believe about yourself. And slowly, something beautiful happens. A new voice begins to emerge. It's quieter at first, almost fragile, but it's yours. It says, "I am allowed to exist as I am." It says, "I can make mistakes and still be worthy." It says, "I deserve peace." This is your authentic self, the one that's been buried beneath years of noise. The more you listen to it, the stronger it becomes. Breaking free from the silent legacy of narcissistic parents doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means refusing to repeat it within yourself. It's the act of choosing truth over fear, self-acceptance over shame. Because the voice that once controlled you doesn't define you. It never did. And the day you finally believe that, the legacy ends and your freedom begins.